I've always loved music. I didn't grow up in a musical household, didn't have like musical parents or anything, but even as a kid, I found ways to fill my days with it, whether it was listening to songs that I taped off the radio or, sticky taping flashlights on top of an old boombox that I had. So I, basically made my own little mobile sound system, that kind of thing. Music, it just seemed to find its way to me, and sometimes in like the weirdest ways. I remember I started DJing back in 1999, and that was almost by accident. A friend had invited me over for drinks, and he just happened to show me his DJ set, which was just stashed in his garage. It was a pair of Technics 1200s and a pair of CDJ 500s, which were like one of the first CDJs ever. And like most 15-year-olds, money was an issue for me. And this was important because vinyl was expensive at the time because there were no more vinyl plants in the Philippines. So everything was imported from abroad. So it was pricey. But CDs, they were affordable. And more importantly, there were lots of them. They were everywhere, right? So when I found out that you could mix using CDs, that's when I thought, I could probably start DJing if I just, focused on using CDs. So I taught myself to mix using compact discs, and then later on I taught myself to spin with vinyl. And it was also around this time that I taught myself to make my own acid house and to make my own trance music, because I had always wanted to be a record producer. That was like my dream. I was in a couple of bands at the time, and I was a songwriter, and that sort of creative work, it really intrigued me, that entire process of making something from nothing. So by the time that I stepped into university, composing, recording, and producing music, those were the only things that I ever thought of. And, you could ask like all of my college blockmates, everybody who I graduated with back in my university, I was the music guy. So yeah, my dream was to become a world-class DJ and world-class music producer. But there was a problem to this. My dad didn't approve of this music dream. He really wanted me to do something else. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps and, join the family business. At the time, we were in the insurance industry, and he wanted me to take over the company at some point. And, fair enough, right? Like, my parents, they come from a more traditional generation, I guess, a more traditional background. It was a time when music and the arts, they weren't things that you could do for a living. Maybe as a hobby, something you did on the weekend or, in family gatherings or something like that, but not as a career, and certainly not something that you do to put food on the table, because, that was what they always told me. There's no money to be made in music. But I was really adamant. I was always a little bit rebellious back then, still am now. I was in a college band, and we had like this small following, and we wanted to put out a record that contained 3 of our songs. And I remember that we really wanted to record in this one studio, because this was where like all of our heroes recorded at, and we wanted to have some of that magic in our music. So we wanted to work in that studio. But like the owners told us that they were booked like 6 months in advance, and felt really dejected because we really wanted to put the music out as soon as possible. And, we felt even worse when we found out how much the sessions were gonna cost. We couldn't even afford them. So, that was really discouraging. So, me being me, I did the only thing I knew how. I took things into my own hands, and I set out to record my band myself. And, again, I just wanted to put out those 3 songs. Just wanted to share my music. And I guess I also wanted to prove to my dad that, I was for real, and, this is something that I could really do, and something I could be good at. So I worked out how to record using like an old beat-up karaoke mixer. All Filipino households have like karaoke for some reason. We also had like a cheap sound card and a really old Windows PC. And at the time, the only place I could set my gear up was in my dad's den. Yeah, not the best idea, right? So you can probably imagine what happened. After like a few weeks of, recording with like really loud guitars, screaming vocals, courtesy of me, and like, really loud drumming, relentless drumming that went to like the small hours. I was being really unfair to like the rest of the house. But yeah, we did that. So my dad, he had had enough. He absolutely lost it. He threw all my gear out. He was screaming, get the fuck out of my den. This is my space. What are you doing here? This is not supposed to happen. And, I'll never forget that day because I was 22 at the time. And, I thought that, okay, I need to figure this out. I was broke. I was a student. I didn't have a job. But I did have some friends and I had some connections. So I managed to find a location where I could transfer like all of my gear. I could transfer everything. And I guess that's kind of how my studio began as an official business. It was pretty ad hoc, but that's how I worked. I just did it because I had to, right? And that was a real turning point for me because I learned that it's not really about the gear. It's about the creativity and it's about the connection that you make when you are in that creative mode with other people, with other artists. And I used to feel like an imposter like in the beginning because, I didn't have a degree like some other sound engineers at the time. But the more artists I worked with and the more music that I produced, I guess the more I realized that, really a huge chunk of learning, it comes from doing, it comes from applying what you're learning on the fly. And that, you can overcome gaps in your knowledge, gaps in your skills as you go along. You can always read up, but what's important is you get going as soon as you can. So the more I worked in the studio, the better I got, and the better I got, the more confident I became as a music producer. And as like the clients started coming in, worked with more artists, worked with bigger bands and all that, that's when things really took off for me. So I was producing artists, they were indie bands, like independent artists at the time, but they went on to become like really huge pop stars and festival headliners. You still find them like touring around the region, especially in the Philippines. And, I was able to do that without a studio setup that costed, hundreds of thousands of dollars or something. Again, gear is awesome. Like, this is great, but, people don't really care about your gear. They don't care how much gear is in your studio. What they really care about is if you're able to capture and I guess record their best performance. You're supposed to be able to coax the best out of them. And you do that by coaching your artist while you're in the studio. And, as a result of this work and as a result of growing my network, I started to get into like higher paying stuff. I did film, I did TV work, I did some commercials, advertising stuff. And at that point, things really started to snowball. So, my parents, now that they know that I've got this thriving studio business, they know that I'm in the music industry and that people in the industry know who I am, they respect me, and they want to work with me. At that point, I asked my mom and dad, half jokingly, so, can I get a tattoo now? I'm in the industry. I'm a musician. Musicians need tattoo. That's a joke in a way. And as you already know, my parents, they're pretty conservative. So my mom was like, no, you're never getting a tattoo ever, Joey. Not over my dead body. You're never getting one. But my dad was like, just leave him alone. Let him do what he wants. I think, we can let him do his own thing now. So after that, I think my dad didn't bother me about my music career anymore. And at that point, I kind of knew I'd arrived, at least in the eyes of my parents, just because I could get a tattoo. And it's funny to think that all of this started out as a need to share my music with friends and family. I didn't, set out to become like the next big rock star, though that would have been nice. Didn't happen, but still, who cares, right? And I didn't think about turning the studio into like a full-on, full-scale business that would sustain me and the staff, while we were doing the thing that we loved, which was making music. Now I was making money doing my own music and also helping other people make theirs. And I discovered that you learn production by actually producing, not by reading a book or, studying theory for years without applying what you've read. It's also not about the gear at all. Sure, you need the basics, like you need the computer, you need software, you need interface, that kind of thing. But you don't need like a full-on recording studio or like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of like hardware, especially today because like software has just got so powerful and so awesome. You're able to do everything in the box now. It really is about the creativity that you bring to the process and the connection that you make with whoever else you're working with in that space whenever you're making music. I was in my studio one day and I was thinking to myself, like finally, I'm exactly where I want to be. This is what I've wanted all my life. And now I got it. And really, it was because I didn't let stuff like gear or, a formal education get in the way. I just knew that I wanted to make music, and so I got started. That's it.